Okay, so welcome to our Art of War. John, Melanie, Brian and Melanie, Joan and Tony. So welcome to our Art of War. It's a boiling hot day here in Perth, and as we speak, we have a interesting pushback happening in Fremantle, where I live, where thousands of people are at Fremantle and they're considering a council motion to vote to go against the mandates because the council has the authority. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens tonight. So I'm doing this Art of War pushing back tonight and continuing on that series, and we've got some good stuff planned for basically the next little while, and yeah, got some good trainings prepared for the next week or two. So today I thought would be a really good topic to get into the Art of War and pushing back, because I spoke about it in the weekend from a spiritual perspective, but I'm looking at speaking more from the practicalities, the legal, and just really what do you do as citizens when your governments basically lose the plot, like what's happening right now in Australia. Is there anyone on this webinar that's not from Australia? Like, just if you're from somewhere else, just type your country, like New Zealand, USA, you know, wherever. I'm just curious if there's anyone here who's not from Australia. Okay, it looks like everyone's here from Australia. Okay, so this is a fairly well-known scripture that's going around or post, and I think that's very pertinent when you're dealing, because you're dealing with a spiritual war, a psychic war, a war in the astral mental realm, and that's the biggest thing I'm noticing right now. So people are just mentally caving. That's the biggest part. And I knew this when I used to be a lawyer and do that kind of work. But at the end of the day, if you can actually get someone to carve mentally, you've got them, you know. That's all you have to do is just get someone to carve completely mentally. You've by and large got them. So that's the key, to completely do that. So we're really in a war for our consciousness, as someone put in a very good article which I read. And I was reading the Pistis Sophia gospel, which talks about the war for consciousness that's going on. That's what I see is happening right now. It's really, if people's mental state of mind is broken, you've lost the war. And that's what used to happen in the Art of War, to break people mentally. So today we're going to be covering like 3 parts to our agenda. Firstly, we're going to be exploring our legal heritage. Secondly, we're going to be exploring the dark agenda that's behind a lot of this a little bit. And thirdly, practically pushing back and different ways that you can actually deal with it. So what I call 5 or 6 different strategies depending on the way you look at it. So let's just start with our legal heritage, because it's really important to realise in the Western world what we've actually got and why we got it, because this is what's broken down in recent years. You know, people start going, let's just do this and let's this person do this. And the truth is, there is some truth in that when you've got a large society, you can't just let everyone do what everyone wants to do. You've got to have some standard or reference or agreement of limitations, while at the same time acknowledging that really the role of government is to be limited in its restrictions. When I was a parent, I very much ran things like that. I gave a lot of liberality to my kids, more than Lot would do, but I had certain like boundaries and restrictions that literally, if they got broken, all hell would break loose in our household. And that's, so having a strong rule of law is not a problem, and having standards. It becomes problematic when governments start to interfere in all areas of our life. So let's just have a look at our heritage and what we've got. So we really do in the West have a pretty astounding history, and even in Australia in its own way. And the Magna Carta, which many of you heard, was a wonderful document that gave a significant level of freedom to England, and all English law was carried over when Australia became a settlement. And when they set up the convict colony, they brought in English law, which included the Magna Carta. What's very important to realise with the Magna Carta, I just want to mention first, is when you read the document, my guess is most of you have never read the document. It's not easy to read, but when you read it, the biggest thing you'll notice is it applies to barons, lords, and free men and free women. It doesn't apply to peasants. So even the Magna Carta, unless you have a sovereign way of thinking and you are living as a sovereign individual, the Magna Carta doesn't really apply to you anyway. It doesn't apply to people who voluntarily become slaves. So that's the first thing to realise. But the Magna Carta is a glorious heritage. The Bill of Rights that many of you have heard that was in England, which was similarly. Both these legislation came about because governments tried to overreach with their citizens, and the businessmen and the churches, the barons, the lords pushed back. And hence we ended up with a Bill of Rights. The US Constitution was very similar, as I've shared before. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, for example, were both highly spiritual men. They both honoured and worshipped Almighty God, and you would actually read their journals about their prayer and regular prayer. And they were very big on that and actually a spiritual heritage. So hence when the Constitution was passed, they very much wanted to make sure there was an honouring of Almighty God. And what's very important to understand, as I've mentioned before, it's not even really imposing a particular religion on society. It's understanding that different cultures impose different restrictions or different spiritual bases depending on the culture. So India, for example, if the same thing had been done in India, you probably would have a much more Hindu kind of constitution, or something mentioning Brahma, Shakti Shiva, Krishna, the Yoga Sutras, things like that. You would have seen that mentioned in the original, in their religion, and bringing it into the law. You would have seen, say, in other parts, like more Buddhist like parts of the world, like Thailand or Sri Lanka, you would have more Islamic stuff over in some other place. So ultimately, just about every major country that's had fairly major freedoms or development has normally come about through a strong legal heritage, a value of the rule of law and rights, and a very definite connection to Almighty God and the universal one God, or the law of one, which means the law of one creator, one Almighty, who's referenced in different forms to help people understand. In certain parts of India, for example, the divine creator is more best understood as the divine mother. In the Western world, the Christian religion, the Holy Bible, the Heavenly Father, the Trinity is much better understood. And that is really why when I teach this, it's a reference standard that we understand and that most people do. And it's good to start somewhere and then, of course, expand from there. So it's really important to get that our legal heritage that we had is very, very powerful. And really the Bible, the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, all of them do give a very strong, expounding of the law of one and the connection with Almighty God, and honouring a higher moral law, honouring the common law of life, liberty and property, and just doing it in their own specific form. And societies that do that prosper. And the good news, Australia, we do have this constitution. Even the Commonwealth Constitution, you will see over here, mentions the blessings of Almighty God. And it's really powerful when you see that. And all this was based on the Holy Bible. And as I tell people, the Catholic Church is the biggest landholder in the world. And the result of that is, and many of the other churches do that. So the result of it is that the Bible has actually got a lot of things still within the West and does give a lot of freedoms. And that's one of the reasons why I've noticed a real thing, as I'll mention lately, why there's always a war on holy books, as well as a war on consciousness. Whenever a communist or agenda is trying to take over a society, they always will declare war on the sacred scrolls, the holy book, and break down the people's religion and culture. Ancient Babylonian culture did this. Persia did this. King Sennacherib, when he came in from Assyria, the first thing they would do is burn down their houses, and they would then resettle the people and break down their religion and teach them a whole new religion. And they would do that to take control of the people's consciousness. And the Roman Empire was really big on that, because they knew that people with a strong faith and a strong moral code are very hard people to overcome, because those people will literally die for their faith and they will do what it takes. So if you really want to take over society, you have to weaken the population by weakening their moral standards, weakening their values. And Australia, I've said for years, was a right target and for the taking for just about anyone, really. And societies like Australia always inevitably get taken over. And we do have time to kind of learn to push back and at least mitigate the damage. There's still going to be some challenges ahead. But if you get enough people starting to push back and really seeing practical, smart ways to push back, I do believe we can mitigate the damage and stop the possibly horrendous outcomes of New World Order, communism, compliant, socialist, universal, basic income system. It's just not something we can sit on our laurels. And I personally have been speaking with Stephen Pettit, we have no doubt that the phase 2 of the pandemic will be to move towards, digital IDs, taking people's money, unvaxxed tax, unvaxxed restricted movements, all that kind of stuff, and gradually moving people's money. So pushing back, getting prepared, and not kind of freaking out. The best thing you can do is, rather than freak out, is take action, do stuff, deal with stuff, and get back to your heritage and say, no, this is worth fighting for. And it is. It's really worth fighting for when you understand it. Our forefathers are willing to stand up and fight, They were willing to get up and say, no, our rights mean something to us. We want the right to be free, and we're not going to give it up lightly. And one thing I'm really pleased, and for me, regardless of whatever happened to Australia and whether I win or lose, in this war, as I see it, I know I can hold my head high because I'm pushing back with everything I can possibly within me, within all the strength that I've got. And I love what Michael Jordan said in The Last Dance. I left everything on the court right till the last buzzer. And that's what I see it's going to take. People who will just say, I will leave everything on the court. In other words, fuck this. We're not going to just let some bunch of clowns come in and take these rights and freedoms that mean something to us, that give us a way of life and give us choices which other countries have envied us for. And, the Dark Ages were a terrible time. And my experience is that when I talk to people about them, most people don't really understand history, but these were really bad, like burnings at the stake. I mean, think about it. For speaking your truth, at least today, you don't get taken out, set on fire, and slowly die a hideous death. That's what happened to you. If you were considered a witch, for example, or you did herbal medicine, that happened. I mean, at least now it's not happening at this time, not at this moment. It's a case of, you get, separated from society, you get taxes or whatever else. But honestly, I mean, people have heard about FEMA camps and all that. I mean, when things turn bad, they can turn really bad. And if people don't actually set limits and say no, rights can be taken away. And again, it's better to take action, be strong, and be centred. And I don't believe we have to go this far myself, but there's no question that much of the Dark Ages and what was around there, we see signs of today, at least in the thinking and the consciousness. And you don't need to burn people physically at a stake, or anything like that. You can, in Australia, you can burn them financially at the stake. You can destroy their career. And many celebrities right now are terrified of speaking out, or doctors, because they think, if I do, I'll be struck off, I'll lose my license, I'll lose my career, I'll lose my reputation. So you can still be effectively burnt at the stake and cut off with a guillotine if you're effectively deregistered, disbarred, excommunicated from society. And the Dark Ages, the biggest threat or worst thing that could happen to you is that the Catholic Church would actually declare you a heretic, or your country or individuals, because then merchants wouldn't serve you. You couldn't participate in the medical system, nothing. And there's no doubt that right now we're seeing signs of that same shit going on right now today. And, there's a good reason why the Dark Ages were stopped, because people got fed up with being burnt at stakes, losing their freedoms and all that kind of stuff. And they stood up even to the point of doing what was right, even to the point of loss of death, reputation, everything. And today, I mean, the only frustration that I ever get is sometimes I ask myself, what's it going to take for people to really push back? Only a small number doing it is not a lot you can do. You've got to get a reasonable number. And it's good to see now we're seeing this more. In the West, we're seeing signs of it. I mean, the ridiculous mandates they've passed in the last week is really getting people moving up here, and it's encouraging to see. And like I said, I wanted to talk about this art of war because it's worth fighting for. This Reformation happened because Protestant protests, and they weren't just basically, people running around terrified. These were strong Christian spiritual leaders who got up and challenged the church's authority to knowing it cost them their life, cost them their reputation, everything. But there was a lot of things that were done in this that was such a big pushback that resulted in a change in that and brought in the rights. And there were various rulers, like Bloody Mary was one example, who tried to kind of bring back in the reign in England. But even then, underground, all kinds of black market economies, the Geneva Bible took off, which I'll mention a bit later on. Actually, no, I'll mention it now. But this was basically came out of Geneva. John Calvin wrote a Bible because basically in the Dark Ages, you weren't allowed to have a Bible unless you were a priest, and even then it was in Latin. And this way they were keeping knowledge from the people. And once the people found out their rights, because when you actually read the scriptures, it's a very empowering book. And you'll hear more later on about how they've tried to water it down again. Because the Geneva Bible in the marginal notes, for example, actually has specific things that go into it and specifically say that although citizens should obey their governments as a rule for an orderly society, as soon as they pass laws contrary to the higher law, the citizen has a civic duty to push back. That's basically what it says in the marginal notes. And the kings did not like that in the Queens. That's why they were doing everything to burn the Geneva Bible. It was illegal to own one, a bit like having ivermectin today. And it was just growing en masse. Calvin was in absolutely flat out. He and his people producing these like illegal Bibles and smuggling them through England. And it was one of the reasons the King James Bible came in was so accurate. It was not so much because King James was a good king who wanted to preserve rights. He did not like the Geneva Bible, and he wanted to actually get a Bible in that was accurate without the odious marginal notes on the side over here, which basically said stuff that he didn't like and none of the kings and rulers liked. So when you understand history about it, you're like, wow, you start to realize we got a pretty damn good history. Queen Elizabeth I was well known for similar things, pushing back, believing in the rule of law, being very wise, preserving heritage, refusing to allow this kind of Catholic mandate in Dark Ages. And she's another very critical one to do that. And I've shared in some of our other webinars about the Armada an extraordinary story about how basically a divine miracle, and where Queen Elizabeth ordered by law 3 days prayer and fasting to pray when the Catholics and King Philip bought the Armada in, the most feared warships in the world, which he used, but they had no chance against, to force England to come back under the Pope. And basically they won an extraordinary miracle battle they should never have won by all kinds of miracles of winds coming out of nowhere and stuff like that after 3 days of prayer and fasting, which is why I'm such a big believer in energy work, prayer, and doing stuff like that. And I think right now, if I had enough authority, I would declare a national state of emergency, but I'd call it a day of 3 days prayer and fasting and say to everyone, move off your ass, get on your knees, and, call out to the one, the law of one, and give thanks for, mercies or whatever it takes to raise the energy and do that. Because in times past, that's been effective. We've seen that move with incredible effectiveness, even in our own state, like time and time again. They mandated our farmers markets about where I live, but they were going to have to all, get jabbed for them to operate. And about to shut down, we did some prayer. We called a prayer meeting. The next day, they reversed the mandates. And I think our farmers markets wanted to fuse in, but that the council said, no, you don't have to. So there's a lot you can do and pushing back. So the King James Bible, as I'd mentioned, was used to overcome things. Even if you read the Queen's coronation oath, it's a goosebumps thing. It's full of declarations and prayer for Almighty God and to do your duty to God and to protect the people and things like that. It's really cool. So we've got a really good legal heritage. We've got lots of rights in there. The common law, the law of one, a lot of the liberties and freedoms are preserved very much when you read the truth of the constitutions and the various bills of rights in the Magna Carta. Like, we've got some really good common law. And that's why there's been a dark agenda to stop that, because throughout history, there are countries of the world today like China and various others that, of course, bear no regard to human rights. There's lots of places that just don't bear any. And that was why the US Revolution happened and why many English wars, because the West was like, no, we wish to regard human rights. We wish to give people the right to live free lives, and they were willing to fight for it and do something about it. And they valued their rights and freedoms. And so the dark agenda, like right from the time of Christ to kind of, and when there was a great change in consciousness, and even before, there was a lot of stuff always happening in the background to try and unravel the rights and freedoms and the raising of consciousness. And a very critical meeting that happened was in 325 AD, where the Council of Nicaea, very concerned about the high growth of the Christian church and not the Catholic group, the actual true common law kind of ecclesiastical churches. And when I was in the underground movement years ago, or off the grid movement, and worked with a most amazing secret agent who literally showed me the leader history books, knew more than anyone I've ever met in my life about what's really going on. He won extraordinary cases himself. I travelled around the world without a passport, things like that. He was the one who told me, but he wasn't in any way religious or spiritual until he actually got more into his work, and he realized how much the law was based on the Bible. And he fell in love with the Bible, and he found his own one, and he actually went back and got one way before the current ones and taught himself stuff. And he was the one who told me, as well as another book by a guy called Alex Hislop called The Two Babylons, explains how the growth of the true ecclesia kind of church, and that's what it was called, an ecclesia, which means a called out community of believers or spiritual people who believe in rights, freedoms, and refuse to acknowledge ungodly laws. That's what an ecclesia means. That's why City Awakening, which is my church energy thing we've set up, is actually called in its foundation document the City Awakening Ecclesiastical Community, because we regard ourselves as a called out group, not some kind of state-based bullshit. And because of the growth of his communities and the empowering of the people, they got together and they watered down the holy books, or they kind of limited what books went in more accurately, and they kind of tried to bring some compromise thing for a universal religion, which became called the Catholic Church, which means like universal religion or united group. And they brought in much of the satanic, Babylonian, ancient stuff and the child sacrifice. And that's why still to this day they do their weird masses where they eat the body of Christ symbolically, why this secret pedophilia goes on and sacrifices and all kinds of stuff that's come out. There was bodies found under the Vatican or in many churches. That's just because, it's based on an original Babylonian religion which believes in sacrifice to appease the gods and spilling of the blood. So they kind of mixed a whole lot of different things and created a Catholic Church, and many different Bibles or things came out of it. And of course, various things happened, like Islam came from a deal between the Pope and Muhammad. I've mentioned some of our other ones about the Khazarians, who are really behind the world control system and the financial system. The Dark Ages really are considered to have kicked off when the Pope and Charlemagne, a massive king, joined forces and declared that everyone had to come under the Pope, and and that kicked off the Dark Ages. And it's a similar thing today. The Pope and the kind of the world universal religion and the state governments all kind of coming under each other. My personal little theory, for what it's worth, is that I just see it implementing a universal weight religion of Satanism, but they're kind of doing it under all kinds of covers of health, masks. And if you go through all they're doing, it's very much an ancient, satanic, radical, high-level, extreme Islamic thing, that's kind of happening. And just to be very clear, there's a lot of very good Muslim and Muslim belief systems based on that. I'm talking about the very radical Islamic in the same way the Catholic Church kind of radical side of things. So this kicked off the Dark Ages because anyone who didn't not only have the state to deal with, but they had the guilt and fear of the Pope declaring them a heretic and saying that God would put him in hell. So controlling the people's minds, their religious beliefs, their systems, is a very powerful thing. And the Dark Ages, I've mentioned it. And when the Reformation happened, at the same time, when they realized they'd lost, they started to set up counter-Reformation groups to sow discord and division and water down the holy books. And like I said, meeting this underground secret agent that I worked with, spent 2 weeks in my house, taught me all this. It was amazing, and showed me all the stuff and how it all worked. And the Jesuits, of course, were a big group that was created specifically to undo the work of the Reformation and create this kind of back Catholic Church or whatever else. And they were like they've even got a black Pope who's a secret Pope of this movement behind the Pope on the surface, who's a big part behind controlling the world, if you want to look at the black Pope. Ignatius Loyola, who was a very spiritual, devout guy, he came and went and had and basically did all kinds of vows and, led the work to try and undo the Reformation, to undermine all the stuff of what had happened and really bring the holy books back under control. And they didn't really succeed very easily until they gradually started to, around the 1900s, get the churches to change some of the stuff without realising by deceit. And then much later on, there was more, which I'll share about now. Because sacred scrolls to empower humanity has just always been important, because when people have a moral code of belief, you'll see they'll die for it or they will stand their ground. One of the reasons why you see I'm so strong and so clear is because I had a very strong spiritual Christian upbringing, learning about the mark of the beast, the microchipping, the law of one, a moral code. I had a very powerful upbringing. And I was a very cowardly kind of a kid. I was bullied until I was, in primary school. I had terrible boundaries. I could barely even say no to a girl who'd boss me around. I was like an absolute doormat. And people who know me now would probably find it hard to believe, but it was my faith and my incredible encounters that changed my life. I was a skeptic who had a very powerful encounter with, with the one, and changed my life. And I developed very strong things. And the more I studied it, my uncle and aunt especially spent a lot of time with me. My aunt was a missionary. They were very, effective people and world changers. My aunt created, still to this day, one of the most powerful, world-changing Cambodian missions called Awareness Cambodia, that even the government gave them complete open doors and all kinds of stuff to rebuild Cambodia's orphanages after the Pol Pot's regime. My aunts and my uncle are probably my two most revered people I've ever met in my life, and I don't say that lightly. When people ask me who is the most revered person or admired person, in life or in death for you, or people who've lived or now, I just straight away say my uncle, my aunt. Literally probably the two greatest individuals I've ever met, and I was privileged enough to be raised by them quite heavily as my rich dad, kind of rich dad, poor dad thing. And they taught me a lot about faith. They taught me a lot about standing strong. They taught me a lot about what was coming. They told me these days would come. I was led to various seminars and things, and they always told me was to get strong and get ready for this time and be willing to stand your ground and do that. And I listened to everything that they said to me. And at times I probably didn't think I listened, but I did. And this war has been around for a long, long time, to do this. Book burnings have been constantly happening. And we're seeing it now in America, this woke culture, and then it's not good. And then now bikies having tattoos, and rest assured, they'll start coming for churches and books and saying certain books are considered hate speech. I mean, you'll see all that shit coming. They've tried to do it a few times in Australia in the past, and every time they have, though, the church has pushed back. The last time they tried was in Melbourne in 2004 with horrendous legislation, but the church has pushed back heavily, and they won in court and forced the government to drop the legislation. But now, of course, the churches are right on board with the agenda. They're completely weakened. They become corporate groups, and they've lost their moral code and been caught with a woke agenda and fallen prey to the dark deception. And that's left Australia very vulnerable. And the Alexandrian Mystery School Library is an example of incredible empowering place that got literally burnt down by the Roman Crusaders. And it's rumoured that the Vatican is a 12-mile underground library with the book, secret scrolls, and repressed information. So, yeah, as I mentioned, the King James and the Geneva, both very powerful books. The Geneva's marginal notes are just like, whoa, And that's why I still have my King James. I have my Bible. We regularly read them. I remind myself of what's in them. I go back to my moral code. And what I found quite extraordinary was when I was involved with these off-the-grid secret agents and people like that, the number of them who told me that even people they've known involved in Satanism straight away actually say to them, well, we know how powerful the Bible is. And the guy who taught me told me one time, and the judge was trying to do all kinds of things to him, and all he told him was he started to bring up the Bible, bring up the scriptures, and reminded him of his obligation. Did it with such conviction, the judge turned around and ran out of the court in terror. And, and judges have privately told some of these people, we know if people knew their rights, our days of Masonic control of Australia were over. But fortunately, that's not the case. Australians just don't know who they are. They don't know their rights. So, this is stuff I can't prove. It's just stuff I've known from being as part of it. That's why I haven't said a lot about it in the past. And really, it's just one of these things that, like me, you're going to have to find out for yourself. But to start with, it either resonates with you deeply in the core of your soul, or that there's something more powerful and more stronger. And Dr. Ripplinger, if you ever want to have a look, for those of you who are a researcher, have a look at her stuff, or Dr. David Daniels, who goes through and shows the war to water down the holy books and the Bibles. And Gail Ripplinger is extraordinary. She analysed all the committees of the Bible translation committees that were brought in the 70s and 80s, and shows that nearly all of them were Satanists. They were New World Order, Luciferians. It's profound, not stuff I've got time to go into today, but you can do your own research if you're serious, And same with Dr. Daniels. This guy here, I got his basically all of his different stuff, and that was released. He was a Jesuit priest, very high up in the whole agenda, who came out as a whistleblower. They tried to kill him 5 times, and Yeah, interesting what he shares. He shares a lot about stuff which is now happening exactly like he warned. You know, he back in the 70s, he was warning stuff that was coming and what was really going on behind the scenes. So it's important to know the Dark Habit holy books, the Talmud. If you actually study the Talmud, for example, it's very hard to get a true version. It's a horrendous book. It glorifies pedophilia and it calls people who are not basically part of this Khazarian sect, they call them goyim, which means cattle, to be killed in holy wars, to be branded. And basically, as I told someone, the way they see us is in the same way you might see a dog. You want to inoculate him, put a collar on him, and then microchip him. And likewise, that's what they want to do. You know, inoculate, put a collar on, and then microchip. And so that's why, as I'm saying, people have got to find their freedom, not move into fearful emotion and become all worked up, because that doesn't achieve anything, and bring out the warrior out of your soul. You know, that's what I want to really speak to everyone's heart today, to bring the warrior. Warriors are objective, they're calm, they're centered, they know they're in a war, they have every intention of pushing back and winning. They know they could well lose, but they will know that if they lose with honor. They don't lose as a coward who 10 years' time realised they gave in because of pressure, fear, and some kind of self-centered, very minuscule kind of thing. You know, this is a whole different book as well. There's so many different holy books as well which can do this stuff. So, like I said, it's a time to really step up, you know, and do that. So, okay, so tactics for pushing back. So there's a civic duty that you have if you value your rights and you especially believe in the law of one, which, keep in mind, Atlantis fell badly because they moved away from the law of one and they moved into a, you know, what's called a lower kind of dark, violent agenda, and they gave into self-serving and greed. And as long as I'm okay, who gives a fuck about everyone else? But as a citizen, we have a civic duty to push back. And Jefferson says when tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. And that's why they pushed back at the revolution. And I don't know about you, I think it's a great quote. You know, if it's when tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes your civic duty. In other words, I will not do this. In other words, I will step up and do what's right on this. You know, there's never a justification for taking away individuals' freedoms in the guise of public safety. It's absolute nonsense in every way, shape, and form. Yes, state of emergencies for a temporary, brief thing can sometimes happen. If there's a cyclone, if there's a really severe virus that was killing everyone en masse, I don't think you would need to impose mandates. I think people would be staying home. They'd be, you know, doing what they could. They'd be taking anything that remotely resembles a vaccine if it could fix them, you know. So there's never any justification. And Jefferson said, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. And if the American people or Australians ever allow the banks to control their money supply by inflation and deflation, the banks, the corporations and government privatised, you know, agendas that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their property, land, real estate, and reset their economies, it's my own language, of course, until their children wake up homeless and owning nothing on the continent that their fathers conquered. So this is what he warned. This is what's happened. And complacency, weakness of mind, she'll be right, mate. As long as I'm okay is okay is why we have got to this position. And it's really that simple. So we do have a civic duty to push back. And there's various myths about pushing back. Like, I mean, goodness me, being a good citizen was what caused witch hunts, you know, is what caused people to comply with horrendous Nazi Germany, horrendous like Dark Ages stuff that was going on with burning at the stakes. You know, being a good citizen, it's like absolute bullshit. It really is. Like, to me, it's a responsible citizen is very different. You know, a responsible citizen really just means that you live common law, which means you do good by the community, the duty. Example, a responsible citizen won't go driving in bus lane just because they can when buses are trying to go through. You know, a good citizen will not go in or pull out. Whereas, you know, a practical citizen, if there's no bus lanes, the lane is absolutely booked up and there's no one in the bus lane, they may just go in there, overtake a few cars and come back out, you know. That's the example to me of common law working. A good citizen or responsible citizen would be very mindful, you know, in business of being ethical, keeping their promises because it's the right thing to do. You know, so being a good citizen is a big myth. It's like, especially when the law starts to violate people's bodily integrity, violate human rights, and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's always got a limit as to how far that goes, you know. So Abraham Lincoln, he did not want to take on slavery because he was scared about a civil war. He didn't want to rock the boat. He knew that the economy depended heavily on forced slavery for virtually cheap amounts. So when he finally took it on, he knew it would probably cost him his life and cause war, and it did. Washington, if you read the diaries, he really didn't want to go to war. He, in fact, frustrated all of his peers because he was the guy who they all looked to, and he kept giving diplomatic solutions, saying, I'd rather not go this far. I'd rather just, work it out. I'm sure we can work it out. And there's horrendous taxes were being charged and horrendous violations, and America was falling into economic chaos and people's rights are being taken everywhere. He still was saying, because he was afraid. He just did not want to give up his way of life. He just wanted to kind of work with diplomacy, and eventually the final straw was the Boston Tea Party and everything else, and then and some huge new tax, and they pushed back, So the Bible talks about two different scriptures, but, one suggesting about peace, another one about buying a sword. And really, religion has been very disempowering for people. And I say, no stage did Jesus say, become a disempowered doormat. He really just basically taught. And when you read the scriptures, he really did teach people. It's just, again, staying calm, staying centered. But the true Christian, spiritual, Hindu, law of one follower is by and large peace-loving and will work to preserve peace where they can. But once someone's at war with them, don't mess with them. They will stand up and eat you alive eat you alive. And Jesus could beat anyone in a debate. I mean, he would eat them, but he wouldn't go and pick a fight, as a rule, except for religious leaders and things like that. So when you read the scriptures, the Geneva Bible, they're a very empowering book. The churches have absolutely destroyed it, like the things they're teaching now. So in terms of pushing back against these laws that directly go against life, liberty, property, and higher law, there's 5 things I've mentioned here that you can do. One is do nothing and pray. So, there's no doubt that praying on a regular basis, to raise the consciousness of yourself and the people and your community can be very, very powerful, So, it can be very, very powerful when you do that. And you can engage in spiritual warfare. And I've noticed that many places that you read about having these extraordinary shifts, like the Armada with Queen Elizabeth, that they started with prayer. And prayer and spiritual warfare is a starting point. And that's where society's been in trouble today. People have thrown out the power of prayer and the power of consciousness raising. Reinhard Bonnke, one of the most powerful speakers in Africa, would not go and do a major meeting unless he first got people praying and getting the area ready. Charles Finney, and when America experienced extraordinary awakening in the 1800s, had the same thing. Rick Godwin, one of my favorite preachers as a kid, told about how the actual story of this extraordinary guy in World War II, who they used to call him like the man with 9 lives. Like he would go in as a fighter pilot, and literally every single plane got bombed in an ambush. He flew out without even a scratch on his plane. He would go into battle and he would just never get touched. He would walk out. Even when his plane got hit, he just got out there with no injuries. And they used to kind of laugh about it. But they had found out he had a grandmother who day and night would fast and pray for him and pray for protection. Like night and day would pray for him. And as soon as they realized that, they knew what had happened. And there's many, many stories like that. So there's no doubt about that. I've had people doing that for me. I know right now I've got people doing that for me constantly. I've got people working because I just know. I mean, I'm going to be, when I'm in the front line speaking this, I'm always at risk of being under attack. When Donald Trump was in power, I can tell you now, I've never said this publicly in a webinar, but I was given a mandate or sense internally. I used to pray for him constantly. I'd be on my knees often. I'd wake up at night, like when the Russian thing was going on, and I'd be on my knees praying for him. And then the next day, miraculously, the whole thing fell over. This happened many, many times. I was on my knees praying for Trump, and it was a call that I was given. So this is important, but keep in mind that all these stories you hear, they also took action. Like Queen Elizabeth didn't just pray and sit and wait. She sent her army out to fight. Bonnke would then send out his people to do the work. Charles Finney in the Awakening would then send out people. So you've got to back prayer with actually strong action. And that is where I've changed a bit of tune. Like as I see it, the rallies and the protests, which at first I was very, I think they've had limited impact, but I've realised that, and that's because I knew that they weren't backing it with prayer. But as I was saying to someone, this is what we're starting to do now. We're starting to get behind and pray and get some groups going to see if we can help these rallies and start to get some movement, And so weakness has disempowered us. And many communities who just prayed end up getting taken over and killed, like what happened to the Israelites in the time of Antiochus, who chose to do nothing and just trust God, and then they just turned up and got killed and tortured. So that in itself isn't enough. Another way is we could just simply go and get guns on the black market and go to war. Australia, you arm yourself, you check yourself and fight for your freedoms. Weakness is, of course, Australia have been disarmed. And even in the US or other parts of the world, I do not believe guns is the answer because they're an archaic weapon. You're dealing with advanced biochemical, biofrequency warfare now. I honestly believe that guns would not solve it. Even if Australia, everyone bought a gun tomorrow, I'm not convinced it would sort things. There's other weapons that now are in place. So that is one option, but not necessarily the way to go. The third method is outright civil disobedience. Like you push back on the front lines, you attend, organised marches and protests. You send basically these, so that's one way that you do it. Like you just basically push back like considerably. So you push back on the front lines, you go out and, like I said here, which means like people getting out and protesting. And again, you'll probably be noticing that all these things have their place, So people pushing back, doctors, for example, or lawyers or others just saying, you know what, although my license is important to me, I'm not going to compromise my integrity. That's why my cousin, Gary Hewitt, who's my pastor, my church growing up, another very admired guy. I can remember when he literally was at risk in dentistry school of being kicked out because he upset the professor, and he was entirely in the right. The professor had done something completely unethical and was trying to get Gary to do it, and Gary refused to do it. And he pretty much told him, you will be suspended, I will make sure you don't pass this year. And Gary took the professor on and refused to budge, knowing it would cost him, and it did. He had to do a whole nother year, and he was so depressed about it. But he did what was right. And in the long run, it was the best thing he ever did, because he preserved his integrity. So for some people, you've got to preserve your integrity, and just say, you know what, I'll discharge my duties best I can, but I will preserve my integrity, first and foremost. Sending letters to government officials, like serving notices, arranging petitions, just outright getting there and just not doing it. Like saying, no, I will not do this, or I will not comply. Businesses are simply saying straight out, we will not enforce these, And I know this business in WA, but just decide straight out they won't do it, So that's another way of doing it. Obviously, of course, there could well be a price, and usually is a price for doing this, but that's another way of going about it. And certainly a very valid way and an important way. And the truth is, if most of the population did this, it would all be over. The fourth one is strategic non-compliance. So going through the back way and going underground, Now, this is a very valid way, and generally has been my way of dealing with things overall in the past, apart from a little bit of outright civil disobedience. So, and the first one. So, doing things like I've heard of people getting, like fake passports is one very common thing at the moment. There's some app which can literally produce an exact replica of the COVID vaccine passport. Someone showed the other day, going and living off grid or in mountains, and or just kind of seeming to play ball, but really not playing ball, things like that, And these are also valid ways, like, going and living off grid, going into the mountains, getting a fake passport or getting an exemption from the whole thing, or just kind of finding a way to avoid the rules and the mandates, that's also, a good way of doing it as well, a very good way, in fact. And I've done that a lot in my past, and that's important. The issue, of course, is that it only solves the immediate issue for yourself and maybe a few others around you. It doesn't solve the bigger societal issue. And that's why I said civic. So it's important for what I call preserving your own energy and keeping you in the fight. So for me, I still do this heavily, but more so I can stay in the game and continue to help people, So I do wise strategic, in other words, I find ways to work within the system. But I'm very aware that if I just simply go ahead and do all that and I'm okay, I don't solve the problem. And at the end of the day, I have no doubt that, it doesn't really achieve anything. So I've got a civic duty. And, even though I've got an exemption, for example, as of my boys, we were actually saying to each other, we decided, like, when we go to cafes in WA, we're not going to sit in these cafes if they enforce the mandates. We'll go take away and we'll live like we're unvaccinated. So that's what we decided. We've got them. Where we really have to use them, we'll use them in different situations. But by and large, we're just going to be living like the unvaccinated. And I've already been doing that because I said we've just got to solve the biggest societal problem. And the fifth thing is a big picture tactical approach to push back with wisdom. So we take a big picture, long-term approach. We pray for consciousness, engage in warfare, comply and give the enemy a chance to repent. In other words, we give a chance and we do that. That's one of the reasons why last year I wanted to give the government a decent chance as well, to kind of think this through, give businesses a bit of time as well to realise, because obviously it's a scary thing. Now there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, if people don't know by now there's a problem and they're pushing and trying to force this, then clearly they're an enemy, And so a multi-pronged strategy. So prayer for warfare, I think that's the number one, personally, I really do. You get that right, get the energy right, you can solve a lot. But then from there, by all means, have very centred, balanced protests and rallies with large numbers that are centred and balanced. Outright frontline civil disobedience, I think that you'll start to see workers have the courage to do that. Why is strategic non-compliance still really important? Like I said, if you can get an exemption, by all means you do it, or some way around, or temporary exemption, and then that will at least give you some time. And like I said, in my case, at least means I do need to use it in certain situations. But like I said, the main reason I know I got it was because I did some prayer before I did. I did qualify for it, but I just did some prayer. I was very detached, and all I said was, it's important for me to be able to move around, do my work without limit, so I can help people in this time. And if I'm limited, for certain situations, it's not going to work. So I prayed, let this be the case, but if it's not, your will be done, not mine. And honestly, when I went in there, I didn't give a rat's ass if I got it or not, because I already decided I'll do what was right. And interestingly enough, it was very straightforward. The doctor gave it to me with no hesitation, did you an obvious case, with your history, and bang, it happened. And I know it was because I first did the prayer work. I've had people going out of desperation, or they just say, look, I just want to be able to go to fireworks and go to the cafes, and they don't get it, even when they probably should have got it. So I do think in saying that, there's a bigger lesson going on here. And the other thing I've thrown in here is creating back-end infrastructure. That's why I'm really busy right now. For example, we've got the Global Wealth Club to educate people's finances. I've been really busy working with people in the back about a school and create this youth homeschooling system and talking with parents and setting things up. I run a Perth Awake business group where there's like about almost 5,000 on it, where people are finding work everywhere affected by the mandate, so you can get job businesses, getting staff and linking up and networking, getting awake communities, network groups. It's amazing what's happened there. So that's the other thing. And that's where, for me right now, my main focus more and more is to do the back-end infrastructure, but I'm also involved in the prayer and do that as well. And I'm training people up and getting our PowerPoints together and then doing a little bit of this. That's why when people ask me, why do you go to protests and rallies? I'm like, that's not my role in this, but I can be involved in this and this to support the people, because if we can help people maintain their jobs, their incomes, their asset protection, find things like that, that gives them the strength to keep going, because otherwise if they lose their incomes, people will just break very quickly. So I would encourage every one of you to work out of those 5 things which is the most right for you and the most effective. My view is that something like this, but we all know our part in the army of God, or whatever you want to call it. So some of you know that that's your main work, for example, but you still do other stuff. Some of you, that may be your role. Some of you may know you've just got to get out there and say, I'm just not doing this. Some of you may just need to non-comply and help your family and many people. Some of you may get involved in that. The main point is everyone's got to do that, speak out and do their role at some small level. I mean, it could even be, for example, like if you're a doctor, I know doctors who are helping people's health a lot, and naturopaths, and keeping people healthy in these times. That's going to be critical with COVID breaking out and other diseases and all that kind of shit. So There's many examples in the Bible which you could read about great heroes and warriors who stood up in dark times. I'm just giving some examples. This is one of my favorites because it's not even in the official Bible. You've got to get the Catholic Bible with 15 extra books. And all the men were terrified and just did what was being told. And this woman used strategic non-compliance. She seemed to be on board. She went along with him. She even told him that she's attracted to him. She's a beautiful woman. She actually seduced him, got him drunk, and then while she got him drunk, she cut up his penis and she killed him. And she ran out and she walked out with his head, showed it to the army of her people, and the men were inspired. And with the general dead, the army was in confusion and basically freed a society from slavery. So, you know, this was, there's plenty of good ones. Queen Esther's another one who's very famous for many, who saved in the Persian Empire. This is a very common one, David and Goliath. So there's many examples. So in summary, remember your legal history. You know, we have a great legal history. You know, we really do. We have a tremendous one in the West, and it's worth fighting for. It's not like we've got no history. We've got something. You know, we've got a really good history and background to base ourselves in and to get back to and say, you know what, we accept that we've gone off our way. We've lost our way in the last number of years, but we can always get back on track. Remember, we're in a war. Don't kind of think it's anything less. We are. The dark has an agenda and are pushing forward with strategy, tactics, and military precision and at breakneck speed. I'm sure taxing unvaccinated, taking money, all kinds of shit are on the agenda, and you got to make sure you're ready and you're going to push back and not let this happen lightly. And decide what you stand for and how you will stand up for yourself and your truth and do your civic duty and push back. And a final thing, one of my favorite little passages from the Book of Enoch, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was prophesied after a great war and a great, you know, towards the change in the Aquarian age, that there would be a great kind of, you know, awakening of the people that would reclaim a lot of the spiritual heritage of the West. And it's written in the Book of Enoch and of the people of the light. So I always like this particular passage. Okay, so that's that. I hope it's given people something to think about, because that was what I felt today, to give some strength, to give some power, to think about how you're going to do your civic duty. And it can be as simple as right now, just looking after your kids and making sure your kids are safe and your neighbours, if you've got a few of those. I mean, it doesn't matter as long as you know you're doing something, which is your little part. And everyone's part, no matter how small, is important. I mean, your part is just as important as my part, because without everyone here, I mean, I can sit here and just talk as much as I want out of my ass and nothing will happen. So any questions, feedback, comments, I'd love to hear it from you. Aidan likes the idea of back in infrastructure. Absolutely, yeah. You know, different social media platforms, Aidan, there's so much things needed. Seamus, deep, insightful, thank you. Nadine, it was a fantastic session. Thank you, Seamus and Nadine. Christine, great information. Yeah, thank you, Christine. Nadine, to do a bit of the 5. Yeah, absolutely. I like that. Some people could be as simple as making a lot of money and funding other people, you know. I know some people just doing that. Suzanne loves the energy clearing, spiritual warfare. Absolutely. Yeah. Look, for me too, I love that too, Suzanne. That is probably my favourite, but of course, I'm more busy with infrastructure right now, and that's why I want to get this energy clearing videos done up to help people do it, because that's probably my favourite too. Esther, you know, look forward to supporting people and parents in homeschooling. Oh, yeah, I remember you with maths, Esther. That's great. Absolutely. Melanie's looking forward to learning about the spiritual warfare. Yeah, awesome. History. Sam, I suspect there might be a groundswell pushing back until the economic spike and people become poor. You don't need a lot. It's just a critical mass thing. You know, if you get enough people pushing back that can cause enough damage, it can make a big difference. Like, you know, imagine if, like we're seeing now with so many nurses resigning in WA, now they're starting to, you know, quietly ask for someone to stay a bit longer and teach us. So, Graham, thanks for the reminder of history, something that is easily overlooked. Oh, Grace, I got your private message, haha. Yes, you're right. Vicky, thank you, always positive. Bronwyn, can you remind me of the name of the guy you worked with? Oh, yes, Raymond Grace. Raymond Grace. I'll type it in the chat. Yeah, so rest assured, we'll be having some videos coming out on the energy work and a bit of start over the next week. So we're going to get this happening, you know. So Michelle, this resonated with me. Excellent. Now, look, do not underestimate the power of 50-odd people on this webinar pushing back. Do not underestimate in your own way. It's a lot, because each of you could affect anything from 10 to 1,000 people. You know, it's a lot bigger than you think. Your one contribution can make a massive difference, you know. So don't underestimate it. I can't emphasize that enough. Hello, we're at war. Thank you for mentioning prayer and fasting. I do a monthly fast. Yeah, well, my Vedic astrologer who's speaking tomorrow, he talked about Australia is in the worst possible karmic charts and planetary alignment than ever. He's done readings for a lot of celebrities, and he's doing one for our private Global Wealth Club members tomorrow. But yeah, he's taught me about even my own charts. And for example, I've got to do regular fasts and rituals to honor, you know, on various days and various things. And since I've been doing them, my life has just prospered, you know. So yeah, they do work. Karen, great info and appreciate the simplified layout. Can all make a difference. Thank you very much. Lenny, we're supporting a mum with 2 girls to keep her daughters out of the main school system. That's great. I mean, I know a mum with 5 kids who they've turned their whole living room into a little mini homeschool for their friends and some neighbours. Now, that's a huge difference. You know, that's like 10, 15 kids. I'm trying to convince her to, you know, Zoom live stream some of the lessons, and then we can get it to other people as well. So, Bonnie, I believe these premiers will be arrested in the future. That's my prayer. They may be, they may not, you know. I don't know, you know. That may or may not happen, you know. I think everyone's going to have their own form of accountability for their actions, and including all of us, which means if we do nothing at all and let things happen and kind of turn a blind eye, we're really no different to any, you know, to what they're doing, you know. And if you're a business, for example, and you're enforcing people by coercion to, you know, jab themselves and go against their values, you're no different to the premiers, you know. That's what you got to realise, and what they're doing. You're exactly the same. The law recognises in criminal law that you are an accomplice after the fact, you know. Because I was asked, you know, what would you do, Warren, if you ran a cafe or, you know, ran a business in that mandate? I said, well, there's no way I would apply it. I mean, I just know that. I would just have to work a way how I would not apply it. But there's no way I would do that because I'd be too scared of the karma. So awesome. So thank you, everyone, for a lovely evening, and go and enjoy your evening. And I will speak to you all soon.